9-year-old Leela Hart knelt in the damp grass before a marble headstone. Daisies crumpled in her small fists, trying to keep her voice steady as she whispered to the carved lie, "Aria Cole, beloved daughter, rest in peace." Because deep in her ribs she knew tombstones could be wrong, and grown-ups could be crueler than bad weather. "If you're really my mom, please, find me," she breathed, blinking hard as the wind teased the trees into a whispering shiver. And that was exactly when a long, cold shadow slid over the stone, and a voice like a sharpened icicle said, "I told you not to come here." Selina Vale stood over her, tall, glossy, and dangerous. Sunglasses big enough to hide the truth, perfume expensive enough to smell like power, mouth smiling in a way that never reached her eyes. Leela pushed to her feet, the knees of her tights soaked, and clutched the limp daisies like a shield. "You're my dad's girlfriend," she said, surprising herself with how steady it sounded. "But you're not my mother. Real moms don't force strawberries on kids who are allergic." A muscle ticked in Selina's jaw before her hand, cool, manicured, latched on to Leela's arm just hard enough to hurt later, not now, careful in the way of people who know how bruises talk. "Listen closely, sweetheart," Selina hissed, bending until her perfume was all Leela could breathe. "Your real mother is dead. D-E-A-D. And if you keep telling stories about ghosts and miracles, you'll end up in a very quiet home where imaginative little girls sleep all day on soft walls and swallow sleepy pills twice, sometimes 3 times when they forget how to behave." For a heartbeat, Leela's courage quaked. She pictured a white room, a locked door, a tray of pills that smelled like chalk and surrender. And then she yanked her arm as far as Selina allowed and said, "Daddy would never." "Daddy," Selina murmured, sweet as poison, "will do what a doctor recommends, and I know all the right doctors." She steered Leela toward the path, heels clicking like a metronome for dread. The grave slid backward in the car window, smaller, smaller, as if the lie could be driven out of sight. Leela pressed her forehead to the cool glass and prayed to the wind, "I know the truth, I know the truth. Please let the truth find me." And the wind, because stories love timing, carried that prayer past the cemetery gates, out over freeway roofs and warehouse roofs, to the automatic doors at Kingsport International, where a woman in a navy suit walked like a decision with legs. Her box braids flashed gold beads like little suns. Her eyes were tempered glass, and when her daughter, another 9-year-old with the same eyes and a grin that came easily, said, "Mom, you're doing the scary face again," the woman softened in a way that made strangers glance twice and feel safer for no good reason. "Sorry, baby," she said, tucking a braid behind the girl's ear. This was Aria Cole, though most of the world only knew the name Dr. Nova, the miracle doctor who hid from cameras and cured the uncurable, the kind of whispered legend billionaires kept on speed dial. The girl at her side was Mira Cole, half of a secret the city was about to learn. "Are we going to make the bad people sorry?" Mira asked, not afraid of the answer. "We'll do better," Aria said, and the smile didn't reach her eyes, because resolve isn't the same as joy. "We'll bring your sister home." The word sister hovered between them like a drawn bow. They moved through arrivals, collected luggage, declined a town car, and slid into a black sedan that smelled like new leather and clean chances. Aria's phone chimed, an update from Evan, her assistant. A board meeting at Luminara Group quietly rescheduled, a certain socialite's calendar now curiously blank, a whisper that Victor Cole and Helena were nervous enough to make mistakes. Aria watched the terminal shrink in the side mirror as if distance itself could unspool the last 9 years. Basement air like metal, a rusted bed frame, Dr. Rowan's shaking hands catching a silent newborn, Helena's voice like a blade saying, "Timely accident," about the woman Aria had loved first. "Breathe, Mom," Mira said, a tiny general placing a tiny palm over Aria's pulse. Aria breathed. Game plan? Mira asked. Penthouse, quiet check-in, no names at the desk. Then we start at the hotel that collects everyone who thinks they're important. Where the chandeliers are ridiculous, especially there. The sedan curved toward the Meridian Grand, where chance and a bathroom mirror were about to do what police and press had failed to do for nearly a decade, put two halves of a life in the same room and dare the lie to hold.
The Meridian Grand handled secrets the way it handled celebrities, smoothly, with thick carpet and smiles that never asked questions. So when Aria Cole and Mira stepped through the revolving door under a chandelier shaped like a frozen storm, the front desk attendant greeted Miss North, the alias on file, and slid a keycard across marble, as if penthouse suites always arrived with a mother's guarded eyes and a child's bright curiosity. In the mirrored elevator, Kingsport's skyline broke into prisms around them, and the past rose like cold breath. Aria couldn't stop the basement from returning, the damp concrete and rusted chain, the way her wrists remembered metal, the way skin remembers sun. Victor Cole's decree, hide the disgrace, Helena's rationed cruelty, pregnant girls don't need full plates, and then the night of labor when the old house held its breath and Dr. Rowan Hayes slipped through a servant door with a doctor's bag and a conscience too big for the room, whispering, 2 heartbeats, as Aria bit down on a folded towel and the first baby arrived too small and struggling, the second silent as a secret. Declared gone in a voice Helena almost sounded happy to use, except Rowan wouldn't let the story end there. While the household scrambled to handle the remains, he wrapped the lost infant, Mira, in a blanket and pressed Aria toward the garden gate, his hands trembling, his whisper fierce. Run. And run she did, into a night that cracked her life into before and after. While Selena Vale, all ambition and ice, lifted the fragile firstborn and walked straight into Daniel Hart's orbit with a script too polished to be spontaneous, tears that looked good in photographs, a headstone ordered overnight. Aria Cole, beloved daughter, rest in peace. And a DNA test that proved only what it needed to. Daniel was the father, not that the mother was dead. By the time Aria found breath enough to stand upright in a borrowed flat 2 cities away, the lie had already taken a bow. She built Dr. Nova out of the wreckage. Residencies, field work in places where medicine meant ingenuity, a private practice so discreet billionaires texted assistants at 3 a.m. Victories stitched to her name until the world stopped asking who she was and started asking if she could help. And she helped everyone she could, because saving strangers was the only way to practice for the one child she hadn't saved yet. When the elevator sighed open on 47, Evan was already in the penthouse arranging equipment, like a mobile clinic had exploded into tidy order. Kits for collation and trace minerals, point-of-care analyzers, a travel centrifuge that hummed like a contented bee, alongside a second, quieter arsenal. Manila folders, encrypted drives, timelines knotted around 3 names, Victor, Helena, Selena. Aria set her tablet on the dining table, glass becoming war room, and pulled up the Luminara Group shareholder ledger where Daniel Hart's stake gleamed like leverage. We need him, she said, not to take, but to trade, not to punish, but to persuade, because Daniel had been lied to as thoroughly as she had, and though rage made easy enemies, truth made better allies. Mira padded barefoot to the window seat, knees tucked under her, watching the city like it was a chessboard. If she's near, will she feel me? She asked. And the question was a key turning in Aria's chest. Twins are a thread. Some cuts can't sever it. Aria tunneled deeper through Evan's compiled findings. Leela's medical files anonymized but readable in patterns. Syncope episodes misfiled as genetic. Labs that whispered of low-level toxins and not enough nutrients. Prescriptions that soothed symptoms while the source kept poisoning. A photo from a charity luncheon, Leela pale but smiling. Selena posed beside her with a hand that looked protective to the camera and proprietary to anyone who knew how cages are built. And, threaded between the lines, the press mentions that kept Victor and Helena lacquered in respectability. The gala invites, the foundation dinners, the legacy profiles that never mentioned basements. "Tonight?" Evan asked, tapping the calendar stamp on Luminara's spring gala. "Not yet," Aria said, because the city's appetite for spectacle would have to wait. First, the girls had to find each other without adults making a mess of it, and fate, for once, seemed willing to cooperate. The hotel's afternoon traffic meant bathrooms full of mirrors, primed for performance, and a certain habit of Daniel Hearth bringing Leela here after specialist appointments to feed her soup she barely ate. Aria outlined the plan. Quiet check-ins, split paths so Mira could orbit the public floors under Evan's watch, while Aria reviewed dossiers and called in favors that would become warrants when the time was right. Then a controlled collision, a fainting spell timed to draw a doctor and a father to the same patch of marble. "Is that mean?" asked Mira. Smallbrow nodded. "It's medicine," Aria said gently. "We make the body tell the truth." She touched the photo of Leela on the screen and let her hand there, as if warmth could travel the wire. "Hold on," she whispered to the child who did not know she was listening. "I'm here." And somewhere, 17 floors below, a girl who had grown used to being tired looked into a hotel mirror and saw herself twice, and the thread pulled tight.
Mira didn't mean to hum, but hotel bathrooms make every small sound feel like company. So the tune slipped out as she pumped the soap, glanced up, and forgot to breathe. The mirror had doubled wrong, not in glass, but in life, because the girl at the next sink wasn't a stranger so much as a copy with ponytails and shadows smudged under her eyes. The same tilt to the mouth, the same glint to the irises like sunlight caught in tea. And for a heartbeat they just stared, two halves measuring a seam. "Hi," Mira said, very softly, as if loudness could scare fate away, and the other girl matched her tone. "Hi," a tremor running under the word like a violin string. They turned in sync to face each other for real, not as reflections, but as fact, and Mira felt something settle inside her, a door she'd never seen swing open to a room she'd always known was there. "I'm Mira," she offered, and the other girl swallowed, like the name hurt a little because of what it meant, then said, "I'm Lila," and the syllables clicked into place with an almost audible snap, puzzle pieces finding home. Up close, Lila looked like she'd been tired for a long time, the kind of tired that isn't just sleep, the kind that sits in the bones and knocks, yet her eyes were fierce and curious, a flame that refused to gutter. "Do you feel it?" Mira asked, fingertip hovering over her own chest. "Like a string?" Lila nodded too fast, then laughed through a tear. "I thought I was crazy." "You're not," Mira said with the conviction of a small general who has checked the map twice. "You're me." And then both of them tried to talk at once. The grave with Aria's name, the mean sunglasses lady, the strawberries, the fainting, the way Lila sometimes went soft around the edges of the day. Mira rattled out their side of the story. Her mother wasn't dead. Her mother was Aria Cole, also known as Dr. Nova. They'd flown in to find a sister because a thread had tugged for 9 years, and Lila blinked and breathed, "Aria is the name on the stone," like a spell breaking. Footsteps clicked beyond the door, firm, organized, the cadence of Julia, Selena's assistant, a woman whose shoes always sounded like rules, and Lila flinched by habit. Mira reached and took her hands, small fingers lacing with small fingers, palms warm, mirror perfect, and suddenly the fear shrank to something that could be stepped over. "We have to be careful," Mira said, voice lowering into strategy. "Grown-ups panic when the truth is simple," and Lila, who knew that better than anyone, managed a wan smile. The plan assembled between them as if it had been waiting. No running into the lobby yelling, "Surprise, twins!" No cornering of dads or doctors with breathless explanations that would turn into arguments and meetings and people saying, "Calm down," in that voice that means be quiet. Instead, something that looked like what always happened to Lila anyway, a sway, a blink, a slow folding. I don't have to pretend much, Lila said, trying to make a joke of it and almost succeeding. Then Dad will shout for help, and my mom, she's here. She always answers when help is real. And Lila's mouth trembled into belief. What if Selena stops it? Lila asked, and the name sat between them like a cold coin. Mira thought of her mother's eyes when she said, "We'll bring your sister home," the way steel can soften without breaking. "We'll be faster," Mira said, and because she was 9 and also a tactician, she added, "and louder if we have to," then squeezed Lila's hands again until the promise stuck. Julia's voice entered the tiled echo. "Lila, Mr. Hart is waiting," gentle as a leash. The girls leaned in, foreheads almost touching, to trade secrets at speed. Favorite cartoons, middle names, the fact that both hated mushrooms and loved the smell of rain, and the small, ordinary sharing braided them tighter than any dramatic vow. "When this works," Lila whispered, testing hope like a new pair of shoes, "don't let go." And Mira said the words that had been beating in her chest since the mirror misbehaved. "For real and forever." They untangled reluctantly, the moment stretching thin and luminous as sugar pulled into thread, and Lila slipped toward the door with careful steps that looked like obedience to the casual eye and defiance to anyone who knew what she was walking back to. Mira stayed just long enough to watch the sink stop reflecting 2 girls and return to the boring lie of 1. Then wiped her palms, squared her shoulders, and darted toward the mezzanine rail where she could see the lobby spread out like a stage. Below, marble glowed, a chandelier dripped light, and the grand piano dozed between songs. Mira spotted Daniel Hart by the entrance, tall, handsome, anxious in that focused way dads get when their whole world fits in 2 small hands. Saw Selena glide near the concierge desk like perfume had learned to walk, and felt her own pulse pick up to match the building's electric hum. The door to the ladies' room sighed open, and Lila emerged, pale, brave, perfect, and took 3 steps into the middle of it all. Time kinked. Selena's head turned, Daniel's brows pinched, Lila's knees softened like paper in rain. "Now," Mira breathed to nobody and to fate, and Kingsport's most expensive lobby remembered what lobbies are for, collisions that change everything.
The lobby of the Meridian Grand was all polished marble in expensive hush, a chandelier pouring light like melted glass, while a string trio stitched background elegance no one really heard, until Lila Hart took 3 steps from the ladies' room, blinked as if the air had thinned, and folded like paper. Daniel Hart was moving before she hit the floor, catching his daughter in a practiced scoop, panic sharpening his voice. "Help, I need a doctor." And then the still, curated room broke its composure. The manager stammered into a radio about ambulances. A concierge hovered with a silver tray and nowhere to set it. People parted the way they do for emergencies and gossip. And Selena Vale, arriving too smoothly from the concierge desk, clicked nearer with concern pitched to the cameras she imagined, cooing "Sweetheart" in a tone Lila always heard as "behave." From the mezzanine, Mira Cole gripped the rail, willing the next beat into place, and the next beat arrived. Emerald heels, a navy suit, hands steadied by 1,000 crises. Aria Cole dropped to her knees beside Daniel, already counting a pulse, checking capillary refill, scanning Lila's pupils, talking low and calm, the way good doctors turn storms into weather reports. "I'm a physician," she said, not looking up yet. "I've got her." And Lila's eyes fluttered, caught on the woman's face with a flicker of recognition that had no reason and every reason. "She's been having fainting spells," Daniel said, voice frayed but controlled. "The specialists keep saying genetic, but—" "They're wrong," Aria cut gently, palm to Lila's forehead. "This feels systemic, ongoing." Then to Lila, softer still, "Can you hear me, sweetheart? I'm Dr. Nova." The words rippled through the onlookers like a rumor growing a spine. Dr. Nova, the anonymous miracle worker whispered about in boardrooms and hospital corridors, the one assistants emailed at 3 in the morning, the one who cured the cases press releases called hopeless. Daniel blinked, some mixture of relief and disbelief breaking the tight line of his mouth. "I've been trying to reach your office for weeks," he said. She..."
We don't take every case, Arya said, already lifting Lila's wrist to feel the thready beat again, already angling for more air. We take the ones we're meant to. And finally, she looked up at Daniel, and the lobby tilted a degree, because recognition hit them both, wordless and heavy. He had visited a grave with her name on it, and here she was, very alive, looking at his child like love and fury were the same oxygen. "What's your name?" he asked, and though Dr. Nova would have been easier and safer, Arya answered with the one Kingsport had tried to bury. Arya Cole. The chandelier seemed to hum. Selina's smile cracked, then reset. "Impossible," she said too fast, and Mira, watching everything, saw the first thread of fear in Selina's eyes and memorized it. "Lila needs a medical workup," Arya continued, returning her attention to the girl. "Full labs, toxicology, nutrition panel, electrolyte balance. Her episodes are not random." Lila's lashes trembled. She found Arya's face and stayed there as if the rest of the world were too bright. "Hi," she breathed. "Hi, love," Arya murmured, the word catching on a jagged edge of 9 lost years and still landing soft. "You're okay. Stay with your dad." Daniel's jaw worked. His defenses, honed by hostile takeovers and hostile headlines, met something they couldn't negotiate down. "If you can help her, name your terms," he said, and if that sounded like a deal, it was also a prayer. Arya weighed 1,000 angles and chose the one that rebuilt rather than burned. "My office, 10 o'clock tomorrow. Bring every record. I'll bring answers." Daniel nodded once, as if signing something invisible. "We'll be there." "I'll ride with you to the elevator," Selina inserted, reaching for Lila, but the girl flinched before she could be touched, and Daniel's hand shifted, barrier and warning. Arya didn't move toward Selina or away from her. She simply looked, calmly, the way sunlight looks when it proves what's in dust, and said to Daniel, "Keep her hydrated tonight. Small sips, no strawberries or additives, nothing she didn't eat as a toddler if you can remember it. If she gets dizzy, lie her flat, legs up. If she worsens, call the number on this card and say green code." She slipped a plain card into his palm, the kind that didn't advertise anything but opened everything, then rose in one fluid motion that trembled only after she had turned. "Thank you," Lila whispered, catching at the hem of Arya's sleeve with a thin, grateful hand. "You're welcome, sweetheart," Arya said, nearly breaking on the word, then forced herself to let go because too much too fast breaks good things. Security made a lane, the elevator chimed, and Daniel carried his daughter toward its doors, glancing back once, meeting Arya's eyes across a field of strangers and stories and choices. Something like a promise passed between them without language. Upstairs, Mira bolted from the rail, heart banging triumph and terror, sprinting to reach the suite before Arya did so she could pretend she hadn't moved the first domino. Downstairs, Selina watched the elevator swallow Daniel and Lila and smoothed her hair with a hand that shook, then turned toward the manager with a smile that asked for names and camera footage, already calculating how to turn tomorrow into a containment plan. Arya stood alone for a breath beside the grand piano, spine straight, hands finally unsteady, and let the truth she had been hunting for 9 years ring through her like a struck bell. She's alive, and I touched her pulse.
Daniel's office smelled of cedar, ink, and the kind of decisions that make front pages, but at 10 o'clock it held something rarer. 4 lives converging. Arya Cole arrived on the dot with Evan wheeling a compact cart that unfolded into a traveling lab, and Mira, hair bead click soft as punctuation, peered through the conference room glass where Leela waited with a nanny, twin palms pressed to twin palms across the pane like birds testing the strength of air. Daniel dismissed his staff, shut the door, and for a beat the room listened to its own quiet. "No lawyers," he said, a little hoarse, "just truth." And Arya, who had built an empire out of withholding pieces of herself, nodded once and gave him everything that mattered. The spiked champagne at her engagement party, Selina Vale's whisper guiding her to a hotel room that wasn't hers, Victor Cole's decree to erase the scandal by erasing his daughter, Helena's rationed cruelty in a basement where she was chained to a rusted frame and told that hunger would discipline what shame could not. The night Dr. Rowan Hayes slid in with a trembling conscience and delivered twins, one tiny and struggling, one silent and declared gone, then slipped Arya and the dead baby through a garden gate while the house arranged a cremation that would never happen. Daniel listened like a man on a plank, the horizon narrowing to a line, and then he told his side without spin. A conference drink that ran hot and wrong, a room he locked to ride out whatever had been slipped into him, a blur of a woman who stumbled in, and a morning he woke to absence and disgust at himself. 6 weeks later, Selena appearing with a baby and a story about a mother dead in childbirth. A headstone bought in haste, a DNA test that proved paternity but could never prove a corpse. He rubbed his thumb and forefinger together, a habit of men who count costs, and blinked up at the glass where the girls made mirrored faces and giggled, sound like water over stone. "I can't change that night," he said quietly, "but I can change what happens now." And Arya slid a folder across his desk with the calm of a surgeon, not to threaten, but to orient. Anonymized labs and imaging tagged to Leela over years, the pattern unmistakable to a trained eye. Electrolytes that sagged at regular intervals, liver stress that pulsed like a slow alarm, micronutrients starved in the presence of additives that shouldn't be in a child's food at all. "This is not genetic," Arya said, tapping the trend lines. "This is environmental poisoning with chronic malnutrition layered on top. Small doses, long enough to look like fate." And Daniel's jaw hardened into something that would not forgive. "Who?" he asked, though both knew the circle of opportunity was small. "Someone with access to her food and medicine, someone who benefits from you needing them," Arya answered, not dignifying Selena's name with air. She outlined the path forward with the same precision she used in ORs and war zones. Baseline panels this hour, first phase chelation beginning today with gentle botanicals to avoid rebound, nutrient repletion personalized to Leela's deficiencies, food protocols so simple it felt like childhood. Broth, rice, banana, boiled chicken, nothing dyed, nothing packaged, nothing that lists an ingredient she cannot pronounce. You'll see energy by week 2, color by week 3, labs normalizing by 8 to 12, she said. 6 months for a full reversal if we aren't fighting sabotage. And Daniel exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for 9 years. "What do you want in return?" he asked, reflex more than greed. And Arya, who had come to Kingsport to take back what was hers, didn't flinch. "I need leverage to cut Victor and Helena out of Luminara Group and return my mother's company to ethical hands. I hold 30%. You were a boy genius when you bought it. Now you're a man who can decide where it belongs." And Daniel opened a drawer and slid a manila folder toward her, the transfer already executed, signatures dry, conditions none. "Justice," he said, eyes steady, "and partnership, if you'll have it." And something complicated and human moved over Arya's face as she didn't yet touch the papers. "I'll take the partnership first," she said, "because priorities build futures. Then the shares, because futures need fuel." Through the glass, the twins scribbled on a whiteboard, "Mira plus Leela equals for real and forever," and then pressed their noses to the pane until all either adult could see was their own reflection framed in children. "Before we bring them in," Arya said, voice softening around edges that had cut her for years. "No media, no miracle twin narrative, no photo ops. They get childhood, not headlines." And Daniel nodded with a relief that looked like respect. Evan slipped back with the first draw kit, and in minutes Arya had a cuff on Leela's arm, a needle placed with a touch so gentle the child only stared at her face and not the tube filling dark red. "Hi, love," Arya said, the word steady this time. "You're brave." And Leela, who knew bravery as the act of waking up again, whispered, "You look like my heart sounds," which wrecked Daniel and mended something in Arya at once. They started the plan that hour. Fluid, supplement, a broth delivered from the only kitchen Arya trusted, and as the girls were finally allowed to collide into each other's arms for real, squealing in stereo, Daniel reached for the intercom and told his assistant to clear his calendar through the weekend. "We're unavailable," he said. And when the assistant asked for a reason, he looked at Arya and managed a crooked smile that had room in it for both rage and hope. Family business.
The first week moved like a tide, pulling sickness out, pushing color in, until the apartment floors between Arya Cole and Daniel Hearth felt less like distance and more like a soft stare the twins took at a run. Leela's labs came back exactly as Arya had predicted, trace toxins like fingerprints in the blood, micronutrients starved in ways that whispered years of helpful additives. And Arya started phase 1 that hour. Plant-based chelation, precise as lacework, mineral repletion in careful ratios, food that tasted like childhood, broths, rice, bananas, the kind of boiled chicken that didn't scare cells. And by day 3, the shadows under Leela's eyes had blurred. By day 5, she laughed without coughing. By day 7, she walked the entire block without swooning, Mira matching her step for step, like a bodyguard who wore beads and a grin. When they weren't moving, they nested. Puzzles spread across coffee tables, 2 bikes with training wheels parked nose to nose in the hall, twin toothbrushes in a single cup, Mira insisting on braiding Leela's hair to match, and Leela insisting on reading out loud because her voice felt stronger each page. Arya, who had spent 9 years treating the world as practice for this child, pretended not to cry the first time Leela fell asleep on her shoulder mid-nature documentary. And Daniel, who had been trained by wealth and war rooms to measure everything in outcomes, caught himself measuring dinner in the sound of 2 girls arguing about whether the puppy they were lobbying for should be named Chaos or Noodle. They practiced co-parenting the way good teams practice endgames, quiet check-ins, clear boundaries, schedules that respected Arya's clinic hours and Daniel's board obligations, no photo ops, no leaks, and somewhere in that discipline, the domestic crept in. Daniel learned exactly how hot Arya took her tea and started getting it right on the second try. Arya discovered Daniel hummed when he read, and that he'd stop mid-hum to listen if one of the girls laughed. Evan rotated between lab updates and quiet security calls because the enemy didn't sleep. On one of those calls, a name dropped like a knife, Helena meeting Selena Vale in a dim restaurant where the water glasses were heavy and the candles unnecessary, their voices low as litigation. The Luminara Gala would be perfect, Selena murmured, because the city looked in one direction when chandeliers sparkled, and Helena replied that accidents are tragic and persuasive, which is how a service panel 2 floors below Arya's was opened that night by a technician whose toolkit included a bribe. Evan's alert tripped as soon as the panel did, and within an hour the building manager was in the corridor with a fluster and a clipboard, while a plainclothes cop asked the kind of questions that made men we think side jobs. Arya didn't tell the girls anything beyond "we're safe," and Daniel didn't tell Arya that his hands shook after he signed the order doubling security on their floors. But the next morning, he took the elevator with them and stood between the twins and the world like a beautiful, immovable door. Meanwhile, Dr. Rowan Hayes recorded a formal statement with dates and details, his voice steady with a relief he hadn't believed he'd earn, and the district attorney's office, looped in by Evan, began to wind a quiet coil around Victor, Helena, and Selena that would tighten on schedule. At home, the twins turned strategy into play. Rehearsals for staying close in crowds, hand squeezes for urgent and non-urgent, code words for get behind mom and dad needs space. A running joke in which Mira pretended to be security and Leela pretended to be a very famous celebrity named Leela from the Mirror, who required juice boxes on demand. At night, when the girls were finally asleep, foreheads touching like magnets, Arya's war room reappeared on the dining table, slides for the gala queued, bank trails, personnel transfers, the false grave contract, utility logs that placed Helena in places she'd sworn she hadn't been, a final video buttoned by Rowan's testimony. Daniel stood at the window with the city below like a lit map, hands in pockets, watching Arya build a case out of bones and numbers. "After tomorrow," he said without turning, What happens to us? And Arya, who had spent a decade telling herself she didn't get to ask that, studied his reflection, the steadiness, the hurt that hadn't learned how to perform, and said, "We choose in daylight, not crisis," which wasn't romance, but wasn't not. The next day, Leela ate an entire bowl of chicken and rice and asked for seconds, a fact Arya pretended to receive calmly as if her heart executed cartwheels. And Mira announced that any gala worth attending needed purple dresses and a plan to stand between Mom and Dad during the speech so the cameras can't be rude. And Daniel said that was operationally sound, with a straight face that didn't quite hold. Somewhere across town, Selena rehearsed a smile she hoped could still win. Helena picked earrings like weapons, and Victor called a fixer who promised the kind of discretion only men who underestimate daughters believe exists.
The Luminara Gala dressed the Kingsport Grand Ballroom in opulence like armor. Chandeliers flung constellations onto marble. A string quartet braided classics into money-scented air. Cameras hovered at the velvet rope, waiting for somebody important to happen. And then Daniel Hart stepped from a black car in a tuxedo that made headlines look inevitable, turned back, and offered his hand. Arya Cole emerged in deep emerald that treated the room like a witness, and after her came two identical girls in purple, fingers laced, faces lifted. The sidewalk exhaled a single stunned sound that turned into a storm of shudders as reporters barked questions that Daniel ignored, guiding Arya and the twins through the ornate doors while whispers ran ahead like rumor sprinters. Inside, Victor Cole worked the room with a politician's grin. Helena wore a smile polished to a mirror, and Selena Vale lounged near the donor's wall with a champagne flute and a plan, until she saw them, Daniel, Arya, Mira, Leela, moving like a claim no one could dismiss. Arya didn't detour for pleasantries. She walked straight past Victor's outstretched hand to the stage stairs as the room's hum shifted into curiosity sharpened by a hint of dread. Daniel reached the microphone without clearing his throat, and the quartet fell quiet mid-phrase. "Good evening," he said, voice steady enough to carry to the back row of legacy money. "We're here to fund children's medical research, but first we have to talk about one child," and 100 faces leaned forward. He told them about drinks that turned wrong, about a hotel room locked against a night he didn't consent to, about Selena arriving 6 weeks later with a baby and a grave and a DNA test that said father, but not funeral, about a narrative he'd believed because it was presented with tears and paperwork, about his daughter's fainting spells and the way hope gets expensive when doctors say genetic. Then he stepped aside, and the screen behind him lit with Dr. Rowan Hayes, not grainy or anonymous, but clean, credible, and tired of carrying this alone. Rowan said the words that made the ballroom's temperature drop: twins, secret delivery, orders from Victor and Helena, a niece named Selena walking off with a fragile newborn, a second infant declared gone who was not, a basement with chains and shame, a midnight escape through the garden gate with a not-dead baby wrapped under Arya's coat. As gasps rose and phones appeared, Arya took the mic, not as Dr. Nova, but as Arya Cole, whose name had been carved on a stone while she was still bleeding, and said, "I did not die. My mother's company was taken. My body was locked away. My daughters were divided. I built a life in the daylight so I could bring this into it." And she gestured gently. Mira and Leela stood, mirror images rendered in flesh and certainty, and the room saw in stereo what lies had tried to make singular. Selena pushed toward the stage with a voice sharpened for TV. Lies, all of it. But Evan was already there with 2 uniformed officers in plain clothes and a stack of quiet warrants that had been warming all week. Victor found his volume and thundered about conspiracies and unstable daughters, while Helena's mask cracked enough to show the bone. And when Arya cued the next slide, bank trails, shell accounts, the false grave contract, utility logs placing Helena in places she swore she'd never been, Selena made a new calculation and lunged for the AV cable. She didn't get far. The officers didn't touch her yet, but the room's attention held her like rope. Daniel stepped back to the mic and did the simplest, bravest thing a rich man can do in a room built for his comfort. He confessed, where he'd been wrong, said that grief had been easier than due diligence when a headstone looked official and tears looked sincere, said that he'd believed the aunt who promised to love his child while quietly keeping her sick. "We're done believing that," he said, looking at Leela and Mira and then at Arya. And something in the crowd, all those donors and directors, shifted from spectacle to siding. Helena tried one last line about protecting family, about a daughter who embarrassed them, and slipped, a fatal half-sentence about Arya's mother's unfortunate accident needing to happen before contracts were signed. The district attorney, who had been standing near the back pretending to be civic, lifted his hand. The officers stepped in, their voices low but unarguable. "Victor Cole, you are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Helena Cole, accessory to murder, child abuse, conspiracy. Selena Vale, kidnapping, child endangerment, attempted poisoning, fraud." The ballroom didn't cheer, moneyed rooms don't, but it breathed like a held note finally released as bracelets clicked and the three were turned toward the side doors. Selena twisted and found Daniel's eyes with a last furious promise, "You'll regret this." But Daniel had a daughter on each side, and regret had already been spent. Arya stood with her hands steady at last, the green of her dress bright as a signal. And when she glanced at Mira and Leela, who were holding each other's fingers so tight their knuckles blanched, the steel inside her eased, not because the fight was finished, but because the city had heard them under crystal light and could not pretend otherwise again. Flashbulbs burned, reporters shouted questions with names in them. And as the officers reached the threshold, Victor looked back and saw not the weak girl he'd chained in a basement, but a woman built from every broken thing he'd thrown at her, answering a city with receipts. Somewhere under the velvet and glass, a technician who had been paid to loosen a screw decided not to risk the rest of his life for the wrong people, and walked away. On stage, Daniel lowered the mic and offered Arya his hand. Not performative, not possessive, simply offered. And when she took it, with the twins between them in the room watching, it read less like romance and more like a treaty signed in daylight. The quartet, a little stunned, found its place and began to play something steadier, and the gala, remade by truth, moved forward toward its purpose as if the city had chosen a side.
Outside the Kingsport Grand, the night smelled like rain and flashbulbs, but inside the ballroom, the air had shifted from spectacle to relief, the kind that makes shoulders drop and voices turn human. Microphones clustered, questions flew. "Miss Cole, will you press civil charges? Mr. Hart, are you two together? What happens to Luminara?" And Arya Cole answered in the voice of someone who had practiced not to shake. She spoke of due process and restitution, of returning Luminara Group to ethical stewardship and funding pediatric research with the money that had once been used to bury the truth. Daniel Hart added what rich men seldom say in public: "We were wrong to trust the easy story," and pledged an independent audit with teeth. The district attorney held a brief press stand-up, charges formalized, arraignments set, Victor and Helena Cole and Selena Vale booked without bail, while the quartet found a steadier rhythm, and donors, cautious but moved, wrote larger checks, as if a city could launder its conscience into action. By the time the family slipped out a side exit, Daniel, Arya, Mira, and Leela, Kingsport's rumor engines had converted shock into narrative, and the car ride home was threaded with twin chatter about purple dresses and whether victory cake counted as dinner. Arya, a doctor and a mother, ruled yes, tonight only. Upstairs, 2 apartments a floor apart, breathed like one house. Shoes kicked into corners, programs spread like fallen leaves. Security posted discreetly in the hall. Leela took her supplements without a wrinkle of her nose. Mira fetched water with the solemnity of a ceremony. And Daniel stood at the stove pretending he knew how to reheat broth, while Arya pressed forehead to pantry door for 3 private seconds and let herself shake exactly once. When the bowls were empty and the twins washed their faces in tandem, they unveiled the world's most aggressive bedtime negotiation. 1 more chapter, 2 more minutes, a puppy by morning,
and fell asleep mid-giggle, foreheads touching as if their skulls had built a bridge. In the quiet that followed, Arya and Daniel drifted to the balcony with mugs and a city spurred below like a constellation they'd finally learned to read. They didn't talk first about love or labels, but about logistics and care, court dates, therapists who specialize in twins reunited after trauma, a media plan that said no more than later, a security rotation that kept vigilance from devouring normal life. After tonight, Daniel said, soft enough not to wake the lives inside, we deserve boring. And Arya, who had never wanted boring until she'd nearly lost the right to want anything, smiled toward the glass where two small shadows rose and fell in sleep. They set rules the way architects set load-bearing beams. The girl's images off-limits, no interviews, school when Leela's strength allowed, game night every Friday, even if game night meant falling asleep on page 2. Arya would shift Dr. Nova's clinic hub to Kingsport, expanding a scholarship arm for patients who could never afford her, while Daniel, already holding the signed transfer, formalized a board vote to seat her as Luminara's executive chair after a top-to-bottom cleanup. Somewhere between agenda items, a gentler conversation found them. Daniel admitted that when he'd seen Arya kneel to help Leela, something inside him had recognized home and panicked at the same time. Arya admitted she'd spent a decade learning not to need anyone and had been bad at it the whole time. They didn't solve it. They promised to try without breaking what they'd just mended. The next morning, Kingsport woke to headlines that sounded less like gossip and more like a civics lesson. Coal dynasts arrested, twins reunited, Luminara reforms, and a photo not of faces but of hands, two small ones braided with two larger at the gala's edge. Arya met with prosecutors, cool and exact. Daniel fielded board calls and said non-negotiable with a calm that changed minds. The girls, exempt from all of it, waged a campaign for a rescue dog with a platform that included charts and a theme song, and lost for 2 hours before Evan appeared at the door with a lopsided mutt whose shelter name was Chaos and whose immediate allegiance was to whichever twin held a treat. Color kept returning to Leela's cheeks. Labs ticked toward normal. Stairs stopped being mountains. On Thursday, Arya hung a decal in the clinic foyer, "Fall if you must, but rise louder," and stood back as Mira read it to Leela like a spell that stuck. On Friday, the DA called. A plea from Rowan's corroborating nurse had landed. A paper trail from the false grave was now an iron bar, and the technician who'd been paid to loosen a screw had flipped, which meant not only retribution, but deterrence. That night, they ate pizza on the floor because furniture is overrated when a family is learning its shape, and the twins invented a game called Future, in which everyone had to say one small thing they wanted. Mira chose roller skates. Leela chose a sleepover every week forever. Daniel chose Saturday mornings without meetings, and Arya chose sunlight she didn't have to ration. Later, when the apartment finally stilled, Daniel paused at the door, not asking, but offering, and Arya, who had walked herself out of basements and boardrooms, nodded once. They didn't touch more than hands. They didn't promise more than tomorrow. But the city outside flickered like a patient with a strong pulse, and in a home stitched from 2 floors and 4 beating hearts, the future felt less like a verdict and more like a choice they would make together.